Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm John Levy from the History Department. I'm going to introduce our speaker. Before I do, two notes. We'll have a reception outside immediately after the talk today. And then also tomorrow at 10 a.m. In a different room, Classics 110, we'll have a roundtable moderated by Destin Jenkins with Jennifer Morgan and Vincent Brown, and also our own Brody Fisher, Adam Green, Sarah Johnson, and Julie Seville. And I'm sure tomorrow there'll be opportunities to explore some of the resonances between Jennifer and Vince's work, which already began to emerge yesterday, at least from the moment that Jennifer invoked the possibility of being kinless. Like yesterday, I wanted to read a brief passage from Vince's work, and I had a few candidates. I swear one of them was the one we were trying to reach for yesterday. So I'll read it now. Social death was a receding horizon. The farther slaveholders moved toward the goal of complete mastery, the more they found that struggle with their human property would continue even into the most elemental realms: birth, hunger, health, fellowship, sex, death, and time. That's from Social Death and the Political Life and the Study of Slavery from the American Historical Review. Vincent Brown is Charles Warren Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard, where he also directs the History Design Studio. He was the founding director. Like Professor Morgan, Professor Brown received his PhD from Duke. He's the author of The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. In terms of analysis, in terms of interpretation of slavery, it's been an extraordinarily influential and consequential book. But no less, it's a deeply affecting book to read. And this is a particular aspect of Professor Brown's work as a whole. There's a very distinctive quality to his engagement with his audience, and that quality has enabled him in a unified and integrated way to work in different media and engage multiple audiences. That includes a web-based project, Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761, a cartographic narrative, an animated thematic map. That's exactly what it is. And also a wonderful documentary about Melville Herskovitz, the Jewish-American anthropologist of African-American culture, broadcast on PBS, which won the American Historical Association's John E. O'Connor Film Award and was also chosen as Best Documentary at the Hollywood Black Film Festival. Professor Brown has a book forthcoming, January 14th. Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, which I think we'll be fortunate to hear about today. So please welcome Vincent Brown.
Thanks, man. Thank you, John. Is that too loud? I can whisper. For that lovely introduction. These are fantastic introductions. I want to keep these and have them every time I speak. And also, I'm so grateful for the invitation. So I want to thank Destin and Brody and Amy for inviting me here, and everyone else who was involved in the selection. Also, Cindy Breshock for arranging my visit, and thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk to notoriously intelligent people at University of Chicago. And I'm especially grateful to be speaking this afternoon in honor of John Hope Franklin, and to be paired with my friend, colleague, and teacher, Jennifer Morgan. Although it is intimidating to be speaking after her. That was quite amazing yesterday, and thank you for that talk. It was brilliant. How do you follow that, though? I was feeling like maybe I had to set my guitar on fire or something like that. Then I thought it would be weird to have a guitar at an academic talk. So who does that? So put on a tie and do what you can. So this talk is partly the story of a missing footnote to an article by John Hope Franklin, published in the Journal of Negro History in 1952, that I ran across as I was preparing for this event. In Slavery in the Marshall South, and in his subsequent 1956 book, The Militant South, Franklin anticipated one of the major arguments of my forthcoming book, Tacky's Revolt, the Story of an Atlantic Slave War. He saw clearly that if the relationship between master and slave was that of a superior and a subordinate, a despot or tyrant and a powerless subject, or an armed victor and a vanquished foe. It can almost be described as a state of war, a proposition I'd like to expand upon this afternoon. Now, I should have remembered reading this. So that essay was reprinted in a collection of essays that my father gave me just before I entered graduate school at Duke University in 1993, where I soon met John Hope Franklin and proceeded to benefit from his enormous influence on our Department of History, as Professor Morgan mentioned yesterday. But I think the reason I'd forgotten the piece in the intervening decades is because my frame was different. Where the focus of my work is the African diaspora and Atlantic slavery, Professor Franklin was interested in the South as a distinct region of the United States, and to the legacies of what people still sometimes refer to as its peculiar institution. Slavery was, from his perspective, the key factor in the shaping of a militant race superiority among Southern whites. And this national or even sectional framing, despite Franklin's discussion of Africa and the Caribbean in the first 3 chapters of his essential textbook, From Slavery to Freedom, A History of Negro Americans, this national or sectional framing has been the generally accepted way of understanding Professor Franklin's work. But there's something else there. In his invocation of the Southern need for Lebensraum, the German word for the territory a people believes it needs for its natural development, and his conclusion that with the onset of the Civil War, racism encouraged whites to undertake what he called the grim task of exterminating persons and ideas hostile to their way of life. The background to Franklin's investigation of the problems that racism created for civic nationalism was Nazism and the global catastrophe of World War II. The horizon, if not the specific subject, was global politics. I'd like to draw this out a bit, framing the study of slavery in geopolitical terms more appropriate to our present. This requires a shift in the geographical imagination of slavery as a problem in the study of national inequality, where it remains for most Americans, to its record as a worldwide menace of collective violence, which endures. Nationalist genocide set the stakes for Franklin's generation. And while I think that that danger remains clear and present, sadly, permanent and pervasive war may be the more intimate threat. So steering away from approaches that observe and compare distinct societies, let me use this missing footnote as a point of departure to illustrate Professor Franklin's recognition of the relation between slavery and war on a broader canvas, across a longer span of time, and with particular attention to mapping circuits of military conflict in the world of Atlantic slavery. Slavery was recognized as a state of war in British colonial America and in Africa too, during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. And my book on Tacky's Revolt accordingly maps the largest slave rebellion in the 18th century British Empire as a war within a network of other wars that integrated the history of the region. Taking advantage of Britain's 7 years' war against its European opponents, more than 1,000 enslaved black people on Jamaica launched a series of uprisings which began on April 7, 1760, and continued into the next year. Over the course of 18 months, the rebels managed to kill 60 whites and destroy tens of thousands of pounds worth of property. During the suppression of the revolt and the repression that followed, over 500 black men and women were killed in battle, executed, or driven to suicide. Another 500 were transported from the island for life. One planter who had lived through the upheaval wrote that whether we consider the extent and secrecy of its plan, the multitude of the conspirators, and the difficulty of opposing its eruptions in such a variety of places at once, this revolt was more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. According to 2 slaveholders who wrote histories of the Jamaican conflict, one of them being Edward Long, pictured here, the rebellion arose at the instigation of an African man named Tacky, who had been a chief in Guinea, and was organized and executed principally by people called Coromantes from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching between the Comoe and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Scholars are familiar with rebels who reacted against their enslavement by striking violently against their masters, as well as with the situation of elite people in Africa who fell into the hands of slavers. But we have not fully explored the multi-layered stories of displacement, belonging, and political predicament that link the slave trade to what I call the diasporic warfare that convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. The transatlantic slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas. Some who had been leaders or soldiers suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, some of them determined that only war could end their enslavement. Mostly it was common people who found themselves caught up in enslaving raids and expansionary wars, cast across the ocean and set down in alien lands where slaveholders exploited and brutalized them. When new conflicts promised to liberate them, or offered rewards for serving their masters, slaves might take up arms for whichever faction presented the prospect of a better life. This process of dispersal from a native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a strange and new one is familiar to students of cultural change, who have examined transformations in African religion, expression, and identity by viewing African American and Atlantic history in a common frame. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in bondage generated a militant response that traveled, took root, and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. This is what happened when those called Corabantes broke out in a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena de Indias, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrections stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican Insurrections of 1760 to 61, followed by further uprisings in 1765 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of the rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa. As historian John Thornton has argued, Africans with military experience played an important role in revolts, if not by providing all of the rebels, at least by providing enough to stiffen and increase the viability of the revolts. Instead of one or two exceptional leaders, perhaps whole cadres of people had military training and discipline, or at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics learned in Africa. Indeed, as Thornton and other scholars such as Manuel Barcia suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in some respects as extensions of African wars. Doing so does more than vindicate the importance of Africa in the making of the Atlantic world. It reveals the complex networks of migration, belonging, transregional power, and conflict that gave the political history of the 18th century some of its distinctive contours. Viewing slave revolt as a species of warfare is thus the first step to envisioning a new cartography of Atlantic slavery that shows how political and military practices travel, take root, and grow in disparate environments. Even as the slave trade forced people to remake and renegotiate their affiliations, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. As Professor Franklin would later do, the former slave and military veteran Olaudah Equiano famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. Equiano echoed the English philosopher John Locke, who had argued in the late 17th century that the perfect condition of slavery was nothing more but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. In theory, Locke extolled freedom as humankind's natural condition and consent as the basis of all government. In practice, Locke invested in slave trading and slaveholding enterprises and effectively defined war captives as a legitimate source of slaves who remained outside of political society. If Locke's characterization served as an alibi for slaveholding, Equiano's, by contrast, was an observation that emphasized the battle within societies dependent on slavery. To the slaveholders, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection? It was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of Jamaica's slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable yet intestine enemies, made subject to the colonists only by the rule of the whip. Rebellion by slaves was a perennial anxiety, a war always the more terrible, one slaveholder wrote, by how much there is no quarter given in it. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack on a continuous scale from the quotidian to the epic. He held this view in common with black people in other times and places, where, as historian Ada Ferrer notes, slaves often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, with the enslaved regularly talking about how to wage that war. In the 9th edition of From Slavery to Freedom, revised by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Tacky's revolt gets a mention. But it is invoked as part of an argument that sees slave revolt mostly as a reaction to the harsh, cruel treatment of the enslaved. This is fully in line with prevailing trends in the historiography of slavery, where slave revolts are commonly classed as extreme examples of resistance to slavery, falling along a single continuum of the struggle for freedom. At one end are everyday assertions of independent will and volition, such as malingering in the fields, breaking tools, or even pilfering from masters. Violent collective uprisings like Tacky's revolt lie on the other end. Seeing these insurrections as dramatic refusals of slaveholders' authority, different in scale, but not in kind from less remarkable activities, allows us to understand the variety and consistency of slaves' opposition to slaveholders. However, while enhancing our understanding of the various ways that slaves resisted the institution of slavery, this frame masks the complexity of large revolts, glossing over the multiple aspirations of rebels, confining the contest to circumscribed locations, and foreclosing important questions about planning, strategy, tactics, and claims to territory, the very questions we ask about wars. The Jamaican insurrection that began in 1760 was clearly an episode of resistance. More concretely, though, it was an act of war, featuring a kind of fighting that is increasingly familiar to military theorists, between great powers and improvised militias, dispersed over wide areas with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. Viewing the revolt as a war, as most of its combatants did, helps us to see a set of connections and dynamics that signal far more than the insubordination and defiance of resistance. The struggle ranged well beyond the limits of plantations or colonies, encompassing and integrating entire regions. As much as it grew out of the everyday experience inherent to plantation slavery, it was sustained by imperial militarism and broader transformations in the nature of commerce, governance, and cultural belonging. It was more than a local outburst, more than a continuation of prior experience, and it involved a far larger and more diverse cast of players than studies of resistance normally feature. It was, again, the kind of event best narrated and mapped as a war story. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to a borderless slave war. War to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders, but also among the slaves themselves. In this sense, Tacky's revolt was but a war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined four conflicts at once. It was an extension of wars on the African continent. It was a race war between black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among black people over the terms of their communal belonging for effective control of local territory and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was, most immediately, one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, the titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these four struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Charting their course suggests new stories of place, territory, and movement, a new cartography of slave revolt that braids together the histories of Europe, Africa, and America. The hemispheric reach of each of these revolts mapped interlocking patterns of state, commerce, migration, labor, and militancy. Across vast distances, these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. An integrated history of slave revolt that considers its sources, circuits, and reverberations accordingly takes us far from the plantations, beyond relations between masters and slaves, and outside the conventional locations for observing racial violence. Vectors of slave war in Jamaica formed a knot in the intertwined itineraries of soldiers who fought in Europe, North America, and Africa, sailors who crisscrossed the Atlantic world for merchants and empires, and slaves who were swept up in many conflicts on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Tracking the movements of profiteers, warlords, workers, captives, and ordinary fighters exposes the shape of the Marshall Archipelago as peaks in a great volcanic network constituting a world history from below. Now, before I sketch the implications of Tacky's revolt, for the way I think about the history of slavery and its afterlives, let me say a bit more about how I see the interaction of race, slaving, communal, and imperial warfare. Slave revolt was race war to the extent that it concerned relations between masters and their vassals. From the 15th century onward, skin color was used as a primary index of social status, with blackness becoming increasingly synonymous with slavery over time. By the 18th century, in British America especially, white people came to expect that blacks existed to serve their material, sexual, and psychic desires. In slave societies like those in the Caribbean and southern North America, whites thought of themselves as collectively belonging to a master class. Often outnumbered by their desperate slaves, the colonists developed elaborate regimes of terror to keep them in submission. And on rare occasions, when opportunities arose, slave rebels responded in kind. Revolts and conspiracies were usually put down quickly and brutally by slaveholders who intermittently anticipated a total onslaught by rising black people. 3 decades before the Haitian Revolution destroyed Europe's most profitable colony in the Americas, Tacky's revolt in Jamaica represented the sum of all slaveholders' fears. It suspended life as they knew it, violating domestic order, halting business, and promising the end of their prestige. For colonists, the conflict was exemplary rather than exceptional. It represented a remapping of colonial America as African territory, where white rule would have no sway. Colonists devoted tremendous energy and spent considerable sums to fortify their societies against this prospect. Enslaved Africans did indeed have their own designs on Jamaica's landscape, guided by the experiences of enslavement and their understanding of the possibilities for escape. And here is a rebels' barricade during Tacky's revolt, pictured in a map that was drawn from surveys taken during the time of the revolt. They envisioned moving freely through the terrain beyond the control of slave masters, distinguishing the plains and valleys stamped with agricultural estates from the forests and mountains where communities of runaways might turn natural dangers to their defensive advantage. They also repurposed small spaces within the slaveholders' domain into places where they could protect their collective sense of self-worth from daily assault, dreaming of building their own societies even on the sites of their bondage. However they parsed their spatial imagination, black and white people's vision for the island took shape within the long hemispheric history of violent transformations that attended the slave trade. Wars that produced saleable captives were principal conduits and facilitators of Atlantic commerce and created favorable conditions for proliferating aggression. Military conquests opened new markets and captured coerced labor forces, while armed forces guaranteed the viability of trade. The eminent scholar W.B. Du Bois clearly recognized how war and trade laid the foundations of Atlantic empire, which rested on what he called a hidden history of sweat, blood, death, and despair. Following Du Bois, a radical tradition of historical writing on colonial slavery, heralded by writers such as C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and Walter Rodney, has insisted that the slave trade was the strongest cord binding the region together, the stimulus for economic growth, and a principal cause of enduring inequalities. The slave trade linked European commerce and colonial development to the political history of African wars, which produced a majority of the captives sold on the coast, whether they had been taken in battle or driven from their homes and made vulnerable to predation by war's consequences, including drought, famine, and failed government. This symbiotic relationship between war, enslavement, and economic expansion rendered African diplomacy and conflict an integral part of the development of European empires. Slave traders on the Gold Coast needed at least a passing awareness of African political territory. Early in the trade, knowing little more than the coastal silhouette of the continent, Europeans produced speculative maps of the polities they encountered or heard about from informants. They needed to know which rulers to flatter, who controlled access to the best trade routes, and who was preparing for battle since wars yielded human commodities. Europeans vied for trade from their forts along the coast, and this jagged line of little garrisons was the first site of European incarceration for captives marched from the interior. From there, they were wedged into the holds of slave ships for their horrific journeys to the Americas. Already the casualties of slaving wars, torn from their ancestral communities, now they had to battle to make new ways of belonging shaped by New World bondage. Among the diverse and ever-changing populations of enslaved black people in the Americas, struggles to define community often turned violent. Historians have commonly interpreted Coromantee slave revolts as quintessentially African rebellions, or as spectacular examples of national or ethnic revolts, partly because, or mostly because, they were organized and executed principally by peoples from a single broad linguistic region. But Coromantee allegiances were more fraught and complicated than this characterization allows. People from the Gold Coast fought both for and against the rebellion. Instead of being dominated by a specific African ethnic group with a clear sense of identity, these uprisings were the product of political struggles among Africans on the Gold Coast, rent apart by slaving wars, among those thrown together into colonial slavery's crucible of misery, between Africans and black people born in the Americas, and among Coromantees with differing political interests. Coromantee insurrections encompass all of these tensions, even in their fight against enslavement. Assuming the coherence of the Coromantee ethnic group obscures then the political turbulence that shaped the course of their battles. Slaves coalesced along multiple axes of difference and incorporation. Language, spiritual beliefs, practices, ideals for gender relations, and contingent political allegiances all crossed and combined with the prerogatives of slaveholders, the social roles required by the labor regime, and the operations of colonial security. No single identity determined how people would respond to enslavement. They took various and conflicting positions, leading to shifting fields of political conflict. To appreciate how the African rebels in Jamaica managed to mobilize a scattered array of co-nationals for war against the most powerful Atlantic empire of the era, and why so many other slaves stood against them or stood to the side, we must examine how they regrouped as slaves, making new identifications and affinities for novel political circumstances. Struggles over communal belonging mapped much more than the making of ethnicity then, or what has been called ethnogenesis. These conflicts traced intimate spaces and close interactions. In the slave quarters, in the homes of slaveholders, at work in the fields, in port towns and aboard ships, and along the pathways that connected disparate parts of the island. In every place, one could read and interpret signs of difference and similarity, of deference and disrespect. People created what the historian Stephanie Camp termed rival geographies in their politics of place. Specific bodies in motion maintained a warring intimacy, charting fluid territories where adversaries made claims that arose from their deepest senses of privilege, morality, and justice. Now, when it comes to geography, the customary charts and plans of nation-states and empires are admittedly much more familiar. Having been conquered from the Spanish in 1655, Jamaica appeared on maps as a British possession, among the most valuable in the kingdom. The island was a tempting target in Britain's frequent wars against the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French, and was thus heavily fortified against attack. Yet the most serious challenge to British sovereignty in Jamaica came from Africans and their descendants, rather than from European rivals. Black rebels fragmented the territory of British control throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and they threatened to take the entire island during the 7 Years' War. This was a global conflict with enormous consequences that have been well elaborated, but its historians have hardly noticed that the Jamaican Insurrection of 1760 to 61 was one of its major battles. The most comprehensive accounts of the war focus mainly on the rivalry among Europeans, with due consideration of Native American nations in North America, but they ignore the slave rebellion completely. Historians of the British Army during the period doubt that the military learned much from deployments in the Caribbean. The most important interpretations of racial attitudes in Anglo-American warfare in the era neglect the suppression of slave uprisings. Even chronicles of the campaign for the West Indies tend to segregate the slaves' war from that of Great Britain. The prodigious corpus of British military history includes scant reference to the suppression of slave revolts in Jamaica, despite the colony's undisputed military significance. Contemporary combatants were more observant. Some of the very same soldiers, sailors, and Marines who waged the most famous battles of the 7 Years' War in Quebec, Senegal, Martinique, and Guadeloupe fought directly afterward against Jamaica's rebels. Now, there's nothing surprising about armed forces deploying to multiple theaters, yet the experiences of these troops did not generate anything like a codified counterinsurgency strategy among policymakers, and perhaps for this reason, military historians concerned with officially acknowledged wars, as well as scholars of slave resistance focusing on local freedom struggles, have largely passed over the way these small, dirty wars formed the linchpins that fastened labor, commerce, and global power together. By custom, we treat war as an interruption in the normal course of human affairs. War is an anomaly in the regular order, a disturbance, a break, an aberration. War is also seen as a displacement of violence from one place or territory to another, with formal military forces pursuing the conquest of territory. We commonly assume that lines of battle between warring states constitute the most important theaters of military engagement, and that peace treaties can mark a war's definitive end before another one begins with new causes and different fronts. By contrast, when war becomes a way of life, as in the abundant violence of slave war, there is no border and no final result. Slave war was pervasive and unending, the natural consequence of slavery itself. But it did have discernible patterns. So with my remaining time, let me sketch a conceptual map of Tacky's revolt and what I take to be its historical geography. Who could exert their will in a particular place? What landmarks and pathways distinguish safety from danger? Where could one find justice and live with dignity? For Africans and their descendants, as for others in the polyglot populations of colonial societies, spatial schemas were the product of violent struggles to address these elemental questions. Warfare remapped and redefined territories as colonists, captives, and sojourners in the Atlantic world charted an atlas of terrors, fear of conquest and capture, of difference and unfamiliarity, of exploitation and loss, of displacement and obliteration. Arising from battlefields sown with ambition, dread, and blood, empire and diaspora set a process of placemaking in motion. In 18th century West Africa, especially on the militarized Gold Coast, warring states mapped their dominion over subject peoples, contesting for trade routes that stretched from deep in the interior to the coast, where Europeans harvested the fruits of war in captives bound for America. Vulnerable people learned to evade attacks and incursions by carving out spaces in the interstices of expansionist power, and to defend enclaves with small bands of committed fighters. They continued their struggles on Atlantic slave ships and in American slave societies. Against the commercial and sexual predations of merchants, planters, and petty managers, the enslaved sought spaces of communion and succor. Insurgents carved out areas of autonomy within territory patrolled by the combined armed forces of empire. Runaways and rebels used uneven terrain to their advantage. Woods, mountains, hills, swamps, rivers, and oceans defined the contours of rebellion and prescribed the options for counterinsurgency, as black militancy engendered the political meaning of the environment. Slaves who spent their lives in rows of crops and clustered cabins knew plantations to be soul-crushing machines, but also centers of social life, where one might find fellowship or potential collaborators among the majority of people simply trying to survive. The bush and the mountains presented enduring natural dangers, which, if surmounted, might be turned against enemies in pursuit. A port was more than a commercial station or a node of naval power. It was also a conduit to the wider world of information, exile, or in rare cases, permanent escape. These general associations might obtain throughout the world of Atlantic slavery, but they had specific historical connotations in a place like Jamaica, a garrison colony created by a European empire, staffed by veterans and refugees from old world wars, and continuously simmering with insurrectionary violence. Like most slave insurrections, Tacky's War ended badly for the rebels. The insurgents were killed or captured, publicly executed in grisly displays, or banished from the island, probably along with many bystanders who had taken no part in the fighting at all. Looking back with a historian's perspective, one can see that the outcome was never in doubt. The balance of forces doomed the rebellion from the start. The Coromantese would not win the colony from the British, as the North Americans would do 2.5 decades later, and as the Haitians would do by 1804, taking Saint-Domingue from the French. But the rebels in Jamaica did not know they would fail. They acted with the hope of success. Even amidst the business of war and enslavement in a colony garrisoned for battle with foreign and domestic enemies, they could find fissures in the landscape of planter power beyond the reach of the slaveholders' whips. They could even challenge the combined forces of the British Empire and find an enduring place in popular memory. Jamaica's Coromantee Wars of the 1760s represented a watershed in the course of Atlantic history. If regional political maps had been drawn by the wars that opened new territories for cultivation, stimulated the slave trade, and enhanced state power, the slave rebellions etched another record of historical movement. They channeled people into new solidarities and gave meaning to categories of belonging, partitioned friends from foes and bystanders, and redirected the priorities of governing authorities. Since Jamaica was the commercial and military hub of the British overseas empire, its most profitable settlement and most powerful overseas military stronghold, what happened there was bound to reverberate widely. Yet the legacy of the 1760s is ambiguous. At the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain kept its prize colony, though Tacky's revolt helped to stimulate an imperial reform effort that provoked a much greater challenge on the North American continent. If the Jamaican revolts in some ways anticipated the Haitian Revolution, offering a beacon of hope to the enslaved, they also left Maroons, free black people, and Africans divided. The Coromantes augmented their reputation as formidable fighters, helping to cast doubts on the wisdom of continuing the Atlantic slave trade, while at the same time strengthening the association between blackness and social danger. Even in the United States, as late as the mid-19th century, anxious slaveholders would refer to potential troublemakers as Tackies among us. Perhaps the ambiguous nature of these legacies helps to explain why they register so faintly in the imagination today. The Coromantee Wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom. They are obscured by the much greater consequences of the American and Haitian revolutions, which seem to speak more directly to the Western history of liberty. But the relative obscurity of these events is also due to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt as war. Few things terrify the wealthy and the powerful more than the prospect of losses to the poor and the weak, which would signify dishonor in a world turned upside down. Dominant peoples and nation-states develop elaborate conventions for legitimating conflict, maintaining their honor in victory and defeat, and recognizing violence as a regular, if unfortunate, feature of political struggle. But between the powerful and those they dominate by daily habit, there is no limit to the lengths they may go to maintain their supremacy. They will commit atrocities and massacres, to be sure, but they will disavow them too. They will refuse to admit that their combatants are legitimate enemies, and they will denigrate the past and present struggles of less powerful peoples. Because slaveholders wrote the first draft of this history, subsequent historiography has strained to escape from their point of view. Yet from the margins, Tacky's Revolt encourages a fresh perspective on the period's political landscape. In the study of slavery, the exploration of politics has taken its horizon to be the coming of general emancipation, which points to the post-revolutionary era in Atlantic history. The 19th century, when the process of emancipation convulsed states from Haiti to Brazil, has come to be seen as a discrete epoch, which threw freedom into sharp relief as an animating force of historical change. Although that era's emancipation certainly represented a world historical transformation, such epochal thinking generally tempts us, as Frederick Cooper has warned, to assume a coherence that complex interactions rarely produce, instead of assessing change in whatever dimensions it occurs and analyzing the significance and limitations of conjunctures when multidimensional change becomes possible. Emancipation, as the master sign of freedom, then, binds the ultimate aims and strategies of centuries of anti-slavery struggle to the 19th century, when those efforts reached their apotheosis. Throughout the Atlantic world, the hopeful years immediately following emancipation were followed in most cases by the reassertion of dominance by former slaveholders. The social antagonisms established in slavery governed the tensions that shaped very tenuous liberties. Legacies of slavery persisted through the 19th and 20th century's reign of white power, with continuing manifestations in the present. Yet struggles against white power were continuous too, during and after slavery. Slaves and their descendants undoubtedly wanted liberation from the slaveholders, but rarely as liberal subjects, that is, autonomous and self-determined individuals. Instead, they fought for the space to develop their own notions of belonging, status, and fairness beyond the master's reach. Narrated as discrete events, all the insurrections of the 1760s in Jamaica are stories of heroism and defeat. Most of the rebels killed, exiled, or forced back into slavery. The memory of their deeds did inspire future generations, but they too would be fighting slaveholders against the longest odds. However, in their courage and ingenuity, these insurgents charted the landscape of force and its limitations that maps of the powerful never meant to show. These countermappings reveal a geography of hope and possibility in the making, fugitive territories carved out through political struggle that were difficult to maintain, paradoxical in their alliances, and in most cases, yet to be won. The dispersed and downtrodden could not conquer empires and their adherents. Even the mighty Haitians, emerging victorious and independent after more than a decade of blood and fire, were hardly able to enjoy their sovereignty, instead suffering invasions, local disruptions, and international insults up to this very day. But military victory isn't the only object of struggle. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass once wrote that a person without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. As a survivor of American slavery and the U.S. Civil War, Douglass knew that slave rebellion was war, and that however degrading war itself might be, enslaved men and women fought for dignity as much as for territory. In the absence of conquest, they claimed spaces where they could defend their self-respect and made places where their bodies could enjoy just treatment. In 1977, Professor Franklin commented on what was then known as the New Negro History, which had emerged during the civil rights struggles and the urban rebellions of the 1960s. And in the context, we should always remember, of that imperial adventure we call the Vietnam War. Franklin had hopes that history can, and in time will, provide all America with a lesson in the wastefulness, nay, the wickedness of human exploitation and injustice that have characterized too much of this nation's past. This is a lesson that must be learned, he said, if we are to survive. The history of slave war in the African diaspora reinforces that lesson, I think, and perhaps suggests yet another one. Among slave war's most important legacies is the fact that racism's primary evil is less the dehumanization of black people than it is anti-black militarism. Its most dangerous manifestation is not exclusion, but the will to domination that treats black people not just as outsiders, but as enemies. The racism that attended, supported, and outlived Atlantic slavery is in this way a species of asymmetrical warfare. Lopsided as such conflicts may be, no power is ever total. Even the most subjugated peoples have dared to plan and fight for their own forbidden aims, with the faith that another world is not only possible, another world is inevitable. Their struggles illuminate cracks in the edifice of racial capitalism, showing pathways to the places where all might one day lay down the burden of militancy and study war no more. Thank you. So we've got time? Good.
Excellent. So we have time for questions. I just asked when you're called on, please wait for the microphone because we're recording.
Thank you, Vince. So I guess I have a question about field, method, and the relationship between your first and your second project. And this is a somewhat sprawling question, so forgive me. I can clarify over dinner. I don't know. I feel like this is an awfully earthly story. Earthly. And one of the things that I found really interesting about your first book was not so much attention to the afterlives, but to the afterlife, right? The relationship between death, the spiritual, and the material, the kind of quotidianness of slavery. And so I guess my question is, when you laid out the different kinds of war, race war, slaving war, communal war, and imperial war, it seemed as if the spiritual only finds a place in the communal war. I wonder if that is that where you see the spiritual playing a particular role in these different kinds of wars? Is the sort of absence of or inattention to, or at least downplaying of the spiritual a consequence of the methods of, say, cartography and spatial mapping? A function of or product of the field of war and society? And is there room for engagement with the spiritual in the field of war and society? And really, I guess to take a step back, is the relationship between the questions you were interested in the first project and what you've given us today.
Okay, great, thank you. So, I mean, the shortest, kind of most flippant answer is I want to do something different. I didn't want to write the same book over and over and over again. And so what I got interested in was how I could kind of cast Tacky's Revolt on a broader canvas, as I said, how I could map it differently, and how in mapping Tacky's Revolt differently, like, we could integrate the history of Atlantic slavery in a way that it isn't often. And that meant mostly thinking about places and times and interaction, right? So how could I kind of take all these moving parts, all these people moving through the Atlantic region to fight this war, and connect them up into a single story, right? So for me, it was ultimately a framing exercise, a cartographic exercise, and what I'm hoping that does, as people read the book, is it reframes our understanding of space itself as movement instead. So I was encouraged by an article by an anthropologist named Timothy Ingold, who writes about, he's writing about mapping, and he's writing about cognitive maps. And he's arguing against the idea that Native American peoples or indigenous peoples everywhere have cognitive maps in their heads. That, like, people have a sense of space that's something like the cartographic. And his argument is that they actually don't. What people have is stories of movement through space, right? And as they accumulate those stories of movement, they create a sense of a region. So that movement itself, right, and Richard White, I think, is very much onto this at Stanford, that movement itself is how one draws the map. So what I wanted to do in this book was move people through this territory so they could reimagine the Atlantic world, not as Jamaica as a distinct colony, territory, and island with its own phenomena, but Jamaica as an extension of what's happening in Africa. Jamaica as an extension of what's happening in North America, what's happening in Europe. And, like, one can assert that, right? And it's kind of obvious. But to actually show it, to integrate those moving parts, to actually map it, turns out to be quite a challenge, right? So again, that was the challenge that I was facing. Now within that story, the spiritual does come into play. So I didn't talk about it here because when I talk about this book at kind of 30,000 feet, I tend to be thinking about the map and how I integrate the different parts. But certainly, when one talks about the affiliations that were made, not only in kind of communal struggles among the enslaved, but also certainly the British Empire's attempt, right, to harness all of these kind of polyglot peoples that it's got fighting in its armed forces by the rule of the Articles of War, right? And the first paragraph of the Articles of War is all about the authority of the Church of England, right? By the same token, Coromontes are trying to create their own military units through oath-taking, right? And binding treaty obligations, which are fundamentally spiritual. If you break an oath, you owe an answer to the spiritual world, the supernatural world, not just to your fellows in the material world. So again, kind of, I do often talk about this as a very earthly story, but as part of those wars, as part of making affiliations on every side, there is a spiritual dimension to it. Only what I don't do now is talk about combat that happens mostly or exclusively in the spiritual world, right? And that's fundamentally important. I'm going to go all the way back to Carlo Ginzburg and the Cheese and the Worms, or the night battles, right? And talk about how it is that people imagine, maybe it's really happening, these forces, supernatural forces fighting with each other. That's not really a part of the story. So in that sense, it's very much a materialist story with people using or invoking a supernatural element in order to achieve their material desires, right? I'm not writing, again, kind of a comparative epistemology of different ways of thinking about the spirit world, where there was more of that in the first book. So, yes, I mean, in my method, thinking cartographically, in engaging military history and wanting to be understood in military history, wanting to be legible in military history, the book took the form it did.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I really find it really original to consider the condition of enslavement as perpetual war, and I'm just wondering kind of where you place that category between the literal and the figurative. Mainly because I'm wondering how the bigger project might put itself in conversation with an orientation like Saidiya Hartman's, where it's actually the domestic and the quotidian, where we kind of define the most emphatic kind of forms of resistance. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering kind of where that approach to studying slavery kind of factors into your own orientation or undertaking.
Yeah. Okay, so we often talk about categories of understanding as being analytical categories or actors categories, or to use fancier language, edict categories or imic categories, right? So what I'm trying to do here is recognize that someone like Olaudah Equiano and many of these slaves and many of these slaveholders, right, think of this as warfare, right? And to take that seriously and not take the military historian's pose, which is, well, that's just what they're saying, but in my own analytical categories, that's something else. That's just insurrection, that's just revolt, that's just, right, that's just tension. To take that seriously and kind of use that as an analytical category and say, Equiano in his revision of John Locke is actually right. Let's take his theory of the case seriously and try to write the history as if, right, as if he is a theorist worth engaging on that level, right? So that's one thing. Now, one of the ways I had to do that in engaging the military history and trying to write all scales of this story, right? As I said at one point, from the epic to the quotidian, right? These kind of, wars within wars in domestic households, these battles over bodily integrity, right? That someone like not only Saidiya Hartman, but really, those ideas for me came from people like Stephanie Camp and Thavolia Glimpf or Catherine McKittrick in Demonic Grounds, right? And that's where I engage those. To think about intimacy as a site of that struggle, which can scale up to imperial warfare. And once you make that move, that really, it's a change in optic, in framing. Once you do that, right, you see that for the soldiers themselves, there's not really a difference. It's only the historians who come later, the theorists who come later, who think oh, that's something else than warfare, as opposed to all of these imperial armies are raping all the time to this very day, right? That's a fundamental part of imperial occupation. And you're going to like say that's something else? That's gender relations? That's not warfare? That doesn't make any sense to me. It's personal as well, because I grew up in a military town. I grew up in San Diego, which, you know, is probably one of the most potent military garrisons in the history of the world, right? The last time I was there, I think there might have been 4 aircraft carriers docked at North Island in San Diego, and a single aircraft carrier battle group can destroy a lot of different small countries, right? And so, you know, after high school, the major industry that a lot of people went to was the military. A lot of people to the Navy and a lot of people to the Marines. And as you all know, the Marines are often the first people there in all of these undeclared military occupations. And I heard a lot of stories from them. Stories about brothels overseas in the Pacific. I saw pictures of people in the first Gulf War, before this last Gulf War, right? Because the Gulf War has been going on for several decades now. I saw pictures of friends of mine who were soldiers with corpses, right? Like relics that they were carrying. Pictures of themselves with corpses of Iraqi soldiers, okay? Like, this stuff is intimate. And the idea that one could write a kind of geopolitical history of these wars and leave all that off and peel all that off was unacceptable to me. So I had to try and find some framework in which I could incorporate the kinds of things I was learning from feminist scholars of slavery with the kinds of things I was learning from scholars of imperial geopolitics. That's the attempt here. More directly? Restate the last part of your question, because I think I'm not sure I answered it directly.
I think the last part, because I think like that really addressed like kind of like right incorporating like the literal and the figurative in terms of considering the category, but just wondering about just the larger project, like the book itself. Yeah. Just like how you like consider like the quotidian and the domestic into right the larger argument of considering slavery as perpetual state of warfare.
Thank you. It's not figurative. I think is what I should have said right away. It's not figurative, right? It's warfare, right? So I'm not using war as a metaphor here. I'm saying this is what war actually is. Now, like the least interesting thing to me is to like come up with a definition of war, you know, or a new definition of slavery. Like I'm just uninterested in those ontological questions. Sorry, I know that's unfashionable these days, but I'm not that interested. I'm interested in optics and framing gestures which allow me to observe things as they are, as I see them, and write about dynamic interactions as they unfold, right? Without like constantly saying, well, I mean, that's not warfare, so I can't think about that. So that couldn't possibly be, couldn't possibly be part of my story, right? Because that's a rape. That's sexual violence. That's not warfare, right? I want to observe those things together and say, oh yeah, that's part of what's happening. That factors in, right? So that's what I'm doing. Now, to go back to Thavolia Glymph, who's a scholar I've learned quite a lot from. You know, she talks in her first book about the war within domestic households, and her second book coming out next book coming out in 2020 is all about women soldiers in the Civil War, right? Called The Women's War. Okay, so one of the things that we have learned, but maybe learned too well, is that women resisted slavery in different ways, right? Some of these kind of more domestic ways, some of these more intimate ways. Thavolia Glymph wrote about women soldiers in the Civil War as well, right? She writes about violent women and how that might change our understanding of, you know, how categories like femininity and masculinity were made in the first place and in response to what. So when I saw... So to kind of give you a sense of this source that I'm gonna highlight here, there were so few white people, for the most part, in an island like Jamaica. 90% of the population was enslaved. So when they're trying to suppress the revolt, where it breaks out in St. Mary's Parish at the top there in the north, if they capture some rebels, right, they don't have enough forces to kind of stay there and commit people to guarding them. They have to go pursue the rebels who are still out. So one of the things they do is they send Royal Navy warships around the coast, right? And then they put these rebels aboard a Royal Navy warship, okay? So the first 25 rebels captured after the outbreak of Tacky's revolt in St. Mary's in April 1760, right, are captured, held, and put aboard the HMS Lively, which comes around from the coast, right? And because they're on a Royal Navy warship, And because the Royal Navy is fastidious in its record keeping, I've got their names. So I'm sorry you can't see this, but it says rebel Negroes here. And then here's a list of these 25 rebel Negroes, which goes down to the next people they captured, which were French people aboard another ship they captured. Okay, to cut to the chase, 40% of those names are identifiably women's names, female names. As Professor Morgan was telling us yesterday, about 40% of these populations, or at least of these people who were taken to these places, were women. So that's women among the first 25 rebels captured at the outbreak of Tacky's Revolt. That's women in proportion to their numbers in the population among these very first captives. I can't tell you exactly what they're doing, but I think that this idea that they're doing something categorically different than what the men are doing in this revolt needs to be rethought, and I think Thirlwell Glimp's work is helping us to rethink that.
Thank you so much for your paper. One of the questions that I have for you about this project is this transformation of the analytical frame from revolt to war, and how revolt is so oftentimes framed as in opposition to something, whereas war is generative. It's about contesting a social order. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what this war builds for the people who are, for the soldiers, for the, not rebels, but for the combatants. What kind of spatial transformations of Jamaica come about through this, and also what glimpses of the social and political worlds that they are aiming to create are available? Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. I don't have a complete answer for you, but I'm gonna start it. And did Robert Hansard make it here? I mean, I might turn it over to Professor Robert Hansard, who's got a book that I'm very excited about. But let me start, and then let me hand it over to you, because he's doing some work on exactly that. Visions of a Khan freedom in the Americas derived from the politics of not only slavery, but empire, war, kingship, kinship in West Africa. But what I can, let me start with the geographical piece, right? And what I thought I could say definitively about this story that I was trying to locate very precisely in space and time was that the Africans who revolted first in St. Mary's here kind of went up along the commercial heart of the parish, came straight up river, and when they were counterattacked, they went down to the port, right? They didn't flee into the mountains, and it didn't look to me like they went to try and set up another Maroon community. There was no place where they thought, like, aha, we can form an independent community of our own. One of the things I surmise from that is that they have an attempt to take at least the whole parish, probably because of the fact that they went straight down to another small bay with a port, which was a short launch from Cuba. They meant to maintain contact with the outside world. That holding that entire territory was important to them, right? Now, the second thing is that in Westmoreland, the much bigger revolt that happened after Tacky's revolt was actually suppressed. The rebels do go to the mountains, and the rebels' barricade is in a detached area of the mountains, an area of the mountains detached from where the Maroons are, and the Maroons have now, by this time, signed a treaty with the British, and they are assiduously actually helping to suppress the slave revolt. In fact, the British can't suppress the slave revolt without the participation of the Maroons. So they basically occupy a territory of detached mountain range here that they think is going to be defensible from both the Maroons in the mountains here and from the planters in the plains. So their attempt there is to create a Maroon community of their own within an enclave within Jamaican society, as opposed to trying to take the whole parish. And in fact, when they're displaced from the rebels' barricade, that's not on here, but they do a long forced march over into the mountains of St. Elizabeth, where again they're trying to seek out some spaces where they can occupy independently. We know that one of the rebels in Westmoreland Parish had urged them, or at least he says upon torture, to go directly for the bay. and try to occupy the gateway to the strategic heart of the parish, which is like one of the most profitable parishes in the British Empire. What I gain from that is that there's a debate, in fact, among the Africans, that I don't know exactly what they wanted, but I think that they were in dispute. Some wanted some things, they won out, it didn't go so well, and the others didn't get what they wanted. For me, that is almost more important than coming up with a coherent and identifiable objective, to know that politics was in play before, during, and after the revolt, and that's what I'm trying to highlight. But the visions of freedom, Robert Hansard, you're up. This book is coming out. Let's get a picture of it.
It's out. You're on. Thank you for putting it up there. I'm excited about that and your work. And I think I would say, you know, it's very interesting. You do have to be careful and sort of really making real sort of cases for continuity coming right out of the Gold Coast region and into this place. Even in terms of the Akan, there are other groups there. The Ga-Adangbi, the Guano or Kire or Chire people. There are other groups, and all of them are participating in the creation of this notion of Akan, the Southern Akan. And so, but I do believe that some of what has happened in terms of the conflict, in terms of the ideations of spirituality, which hint at notions of freedom, do manifest themselves in these processes. That would be the argument that I would sort of say. You can look for some continuities, you just have to be careful. I mean, but just the idea that you have things in St. Elizabeth, which is way over here in the north on the leeward side, and then Westmoreland, west, and I mean, there had to have been some form of communication or dialogue.
Absolutely.
That we got to think about. And there's an interesting tidbit in the Thistlewood Journal where they see a comet. Some guy sees a comet, and he's not a slave. He's wandering in the mountains, but he sees a comet. And I get the idea that for other folks, they may have had different motivations, but the importance of seeing something from the sky might have some impetus for a range of responses, you know. And even Tacky himself, which I know you mentioned, you know, as a figure. Some folks say that he just looks like this beautiful man that was from the Gold Coast, but in actuality, he just looked like him. That didn't mean he had all these martial skill sets, you know. So it's
that's Edward Long. That's Edward Long trying to demean him.
Yes,
for sure. This takes us back to the question that Destin posed right away, right? Which is kind of, you know, your answer gets us into the spiritual discourse of the Akan. And again, what I wanted to do was, like, what if I were to just try and do a narrative history of this revolt, moment by moment, point by point, with all these pieces connecting up, and not spend as much time on that kind of thematic material as I did in the first book. And that's the difference. That's why, you know, my book isn't mutually exclusive from these other books here. It's meant to be read, you know, in dialogue with them. We should shout out to Walter Rucker as well, because Walter Rucker's book on Gold Coast diasporas posits the idea that there is a, how does he call it, a kind of egalitarian sentiment, in part because not many of these people who were captured were leaders, were elites. So there's a kind of egalitarian ethos among these people that may be also in play, like, and may create a fracture between people like Tacky and people like the rest of the rebels, right? That, again, there's politics in play, and that kind of egalitarian ethos is something that he teases out of various things that he's finding there. Yeah, I mean, I didn't write this book so that there can be only one. I'm not the Highlander, you know? Like, what I want to do is start this conversation and say, like, okay, so now we can take Kwasi Kanata, we can take Walter Rucker, we can take Robert Hansard, and we can locate what they have to say very precisely in space and time. And when you read the book, I spent a lot of time on here, but even more in the book, this is about the political meaning of the landscape itself, not so much spiritual, but the political meaning in terms of who can be, the questions I asked, who can be safe where? How do I identify safety from danger? Right? Who's coming to get me and who's coming to help me? What I wanted to do is locate that in the landscape of Jamaica. So again, it's a kind of map of how people can move through the landscape in this fraught and violent context. Jennifer.
Thank you so much for this. I don't want to I guess I want to ask you a kind of historiographical question about where your work lies, because I see us making similar interventions, you and I'm thinking it has something to do with Duke or whatever. But there was a point in your talk when you're making an argument that says that the Atlantic is the 18th century Atlantic is a site that's a theater of war, and that's something that that military historians are comfortable with, but they never include the lessons learned and the battles fought around slavery and around suppressing slavery. So that to me is very much an argument about the role of slavery in the way that the modern Atlantic world opens up, like in the way that we understand these broad historical phenomena, right? And I guess I'm completely compelled by this. Obviously, we are fellow travelers, but I also just wonder how we find ourselves making this argument over and over again. You know what I mean? And I think that in a way, your insistence that revolt needs to be understood not just as reactive, but as generative, as an attempt to be generative, is also, it's very much sort of in line with Cedric Robinson's notion about what constitutes a Black radical tradition. So that, I thought I was going to end this up as a question, but I think it's really more just an acknowledgement that there's a task at hand here that you are clearly taking up, and that I have taken up, that others have as well, which is about demanding a reframing of these broader imperial histories in which the lives of African people and African descendant people are at the center. So I think I can add at least a little story to that, one that emerges from the book, and the kind of, the negative argument with military historians, and then the positive argument about the Black radical tradition. So, the Royal Marines are newly reorganized for the 7 Years' War in the British Empire, right? It's a brand new outfit. And the first campaigns of the Royal Marines are the conquest of Senegal, where they have one great victory, and then they lose to a combined African and French force, and it's mostly Africans. It's Africans allied with the French at Albreda when they go up the Gambia River, right? And the lead ship on this adventure, this attempt to conquer Senegal, is HMS Harwich. And the Harwich sails straight from Senegal to Jamaica, where those very Marines are involved in the suppression of Tacky's revolt. One of the other major campaigns in the 7 Years' War is the Conquest of Guadeloupe, right? The failed attempt at Martinique and the Conquest of Guadeloupe. And the Marines who conquer Guadeloupe are fighting black French soldiers who are under arms, many of them enslaved, right? When they conquer Guadeloupe. They take a lot of these black French soldiers to Jamaica and sell them as slaves, where some of them escape and join Tacky's revolt. So you've got Marines on the Harwich fighting and losing to black people in the Gambia River, and then coming to Jamaica to suppress this revolt. You've got Marines fighting in Guadeloupe, right, conquering French black soldiers there, and then coming to Jamaica directly after Guadeloupe and having to fight them again. I don't have the names of those black soldiers, but I've got the names of a lot of those Marines, and I know they go straight into the mountains to fight these people, who probably include some of these black soldiers, having to fight them on the same island. And yet military historians are like, I don't think the Marines learned anything from that, even though these are their very first amphibious engagements. And that's what they do, amphibious engagements. That's what the Marines have always done. That's what they're organized to do. The very first lessons they learn are from fighting black people in the bush in Africa and the Caribbean. And yet the military historians ignore that. So, yes, I mean, if they want to know their stuff, they got to know my stuff. That's that point. The broader point, though, and again, this is just to affirm your point, which is that, I think that it's important not to assume that the struggle for black humanity, for dignity, begins with emancipation, begins with civil rights. It begins with the indignities themselves. And I do think that there's a pessimism, right,
which often suggests that one needs only to understand the logic of anti-blackness in order to understand the politics of anti-blackness. And what I'm saying is the logic of anti-blackness only gets you so far because it is emergent, right? And it is always in dialogue with, reacting to, responding to, engaged with black struggle going all the way back, right? So if I only understand, say, the logic of slavery or the logic of racism, I'm not understanding how it emerges from these actual struggles, nay, these wars, right, which all these ideas take their generative form from.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It's really fascinating. I want to come back to Destin's question again, if I may. One of the things that I was thinking of as you were engaged in the sort of the later iteration of that conversation was Ranajit Guha's The Prose of Counterinsurgency. So the basic premise is that the way in which Europeans rendered events can't simply be inverted to get us at some sort of, brushing against the grain doesn't get us to where we are. There is also a second layer, and access to that layer requires some sort of knowledge that's challenging to come by. But one of the things that it occurs to me about the way in which you explain the patterns of movement is that it's always instrumental. It's always motivated by, they go to the harbor because the harbor opens them to the outside world, or they go to the mountains because there's some sort of strategic advantage to doing so, as opposed to what I take to be the more, the alternative conception of space and place that relates to, say, indigenous studies that you invoked in your own talk, is that it's motivated more by the sort of, the meanings of particular kinds of boundary locations, or the meanings of particular kinds of spatial phenomena that have a different kind of resonance in that instance. It might have nothing to do with strategic advantage or motivation. And so I wondered to what extent, when you're trying to infer with this sort of very partial record that's available to you, the intentions behind particular kinds of mobilized actions in the context of a conflict, how you balance some sort of rationalist strategic sensibility with something that simply wouldn't be operating in relationship to the same kind of metric, and how you can draw out that second order information from the kinds of sources that you're working with. Yeah,
and that's a great question, and it's a fair critique as well, implied. And it's one they anticipate in a map that I made, a kind of animated map of the revolt itself, where I say that the spatial schemas of the rebels, kind of their landmarks and pathways, their understandings of certainly what space means, whether it's sacred space or whether it's profane space, is probably irretrievable in cartographic form, right? So there's that. And since I don't have much of I don't have any of their writing, I don't have any kind of commentaries from them for the most part about what particular places meant, it was something that did not fit within the kind of temporality I was using for this story. And let me kind of back up and explain that a little bit more. When I decided, right, when I committed to a narrative account which was going to try and locate things in place and time, I also in some ways eschewed a far more thematic account in which the temporality would be radically different, in which one would understand a place, right, culturally, as a logic that might obtain over centuries. It just did not fit, and I was never comfortable, and still wouldn't be, never comfortable saying, aha, I've got an ethnographic account of a place, which I can then infer it might have meant in 1760. And because I couldn't do that, I left that conversation alone. I think that's a conversation one could still have. Again, as I was saying to Robert, I think that one could take my book and then say, aha, but like here are the ways in which these spaces signified ethnographically in various places and times with a different temporality, and maybe I can project back, I can upstream what that space might have meant. It was a conversation I didn't really want to get into. What I wanted to spend my time doing was really locating what happened, when happened, some gestures toward why it might have happened, most of them not as ethnographic as the gestures in my first book, in part because I think that it would be a different kind of book. I think it would have a different kind of, it would just be a different kind of narrative. It would be far more thematic, far more synchronic than I wanted to have here. And this was a different exercise for me. There was something else in your invocation of Guha. Yeah, so one of the things that I try to do is not just kind of take one account like Edward Long's and just, reverse it, but to take as many possible accounts of various kinds of movements as I can and say, we can see from this that Edward Long is mistaken, or he's lying, or he's lost the plot. Maybe he's panicked. That a lot of his writing emerges out of that larger conflicted milieu, right? And we can see that by surrounding him with lots of other sources. So it's not so much a matter of just taking, a single source or a couple of sources and reading them against the grain. It's trying to read every source as an artifact of the larger universe that one can see by looking at many other sources, right? So one of my, I don't even think it's a disagreement, but one of the limitations of writing about the limitations of sources, as a lot of us have done in the studies of the archive, and as I've done myself in various places, is that we kind of assume that the sources we know are the universe of sources, right? But oftentimes, other sources, they allow you to see things from different angles. And they allow you to see the source that you thought, like, oh, that source fixes what I can say, right? They allow you to see it differently, and you can say something different. So it's not just reading that source against the grain, it's reading that source against all these other sources. And I'm inspired, in this by people like archaeologists, right, who are trying to reconstruct whole societies from shards of pottery. They don't feel sorry for me and the challenges I have with sources. So again, there are scholars who acknowledge the limitations of certain kind of sources and then kind of dare, maybe foolishly, to read as creatively and expansively as possible. And those are the scholars I most admire and I most want to emulate.
Excellent. I think we'll stop there. One more time. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. we're in a different room, Classics 110. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.